In the middle of a dead, dry field, a police dog sits down at a locked steel trailer and refuses to move. Inside, left for the dry season to finish, a man is still breathing, barely. He grabs the agent's wrist and begs her one thing: "Don't take me back to them." But he won't say who they are. And the people who did this are the ones everyone in town trusts most. Stay with me, because the one who never stopped searching for the truth had 4 legs and a name no one will ever forget. Chapter 1. The Locked Door. The valley had not seen rain in 4 months, and by August the land around Cordra looked like something the sky had given up on. The irrigation canals ran in cracked gray lines through the fields, empty as old riverbeds, and the dust rose at the smallest provocation, settling on everything in a fine pale film. Quinn Delgado stood at the edge of the abandoned packing yard, with one hand shading her eyes and the other resting, out of habit, on the worn leather lead that ran down to Nico. She was 29 and looked, on days like this, a little older than that. Her dark hair was tied low and plain, the way she wore it for field work, and her windbreaker had faded from navy to something closer to slate, the yellow letters on the back gone chalky at the edges. On her left wrist she wore a string of wooden beads, smooth from years of being turned between someone else's fingers and now hers. Her father had worn them on the job for 30 years. He had not lived to see her sworn in, and she had stopped explaining the beads to people who asked. Routine, the supervisor had called it that morning, and Quinn had nodded the way you nod at a word everyone knows is a small lie. The task force had tracked a paper trail, loan files, a string of names that did not quite belong to the people who carried them, to a defunct produce operation on the dry side of the county. The theory was a records cache. Somewhere in the skeleton of the old packing house, the working theory went, somebody had left behind the kind of documents that did not survive an honest accounting. 2 other agents worked the main building. A deputy leaned against a county truck near the gate, drinking from a thermos, doing the slow arithmetic of an afternoon that would end with nothing. Nico had other ideas. He was a 4-year-old shepherd, black and tan, ears up and forward, with a thin, pale line of an old scar tracing the side of his muzzle where a fence had caught him as a pup. Dual purpose, the certification said, patrol and detection, a working dog who could clear a building and find what a building tried to hide. He moved the way good dogs move when the work is real and not a drill, nose low, then high, reading a story written in a language no person would ever fully learn. Quinn had given him the line to range, and for a while he had quartered the yard with the patient thoroughness she trusted more than most of the people she had ever partnered with. Then he stopped. He had drifted past a row of shipping trailers parked along the far fence, sun-bleached and rusting, the kind of metal boxes that bake in the dry season until the air around them shimmers. He passed the first. He passed the second. At the third he came back, circled once, and sat. He didn't bark. He did not paw at the door. He simply lowered himself onto his haunches in the dust and looked at the locked steel handle, then over his shoulder at Quinn, and held there, the still, deliberate alert of a dog who has decided something and is waiting to be believed. Nico. She said his name low, a question and a steadying both. He didn't move. She walked over, and the heat coming off the trailer reached her before she did, a wall of it, the steel ticking faintly as it expanded under the sun. The padlock was newer than the rust around it. That was the first thing she noticed, the way you notice a fresh stitch in an old coat. The second thing she noticed was the silence, the particular weight of a place that is supposed to be empty. The third thing she noticed was the sound. It came from inside the trailer, so faint she first mistook it for the metal settling. A dry scraping, fingernails or worse, dragging across a floor that had no give in it. Then it stopped, and what followed was worse than the scraping. A breath. A long, labored draw of air that caught somewhere in the middle and came apart. The sound of a body spending more than it had to do, the one thing a body must keep doing. Quinn went very still. Beside her, Nico's ears swiveled toward the door, and a low sound moved through his chest. Not a growl, something gentler and more urgent, the noise a dog makes when the thing it has found turns out to be alive. "Hey," she was already keying her radio. "I've got an alert on a trailer, southeast fence, and I think there's somebody inside. I need bolt cutters, and I need medical now." She did not wait for the answer. The padlock was newer, but the hinges were old, and she had a pry bar off her belt and into the gap before the deputy had set down his thermos. The metal screamed and gave. The door swung, and the heat that rolled out of that box was a living thing, thick and close, and underneath it the smell of a person who had been in there too long. He was in the far corner, folded against the wall, the way a man folds when sitting upright has become the last work he can do. He was perhaps in his early 30s, lean and ropey through the shoulders, with a few days of dark beard and a face that the dry season had taken the color out of, leaving it the gray of old paper. His eyes were open. That was the part Quinn would carry afterward, the way you carry certain images without permission. His eyes were open, and they could not hold on to her, sliding off and away and coming back, the eyes of someone whose spirit had been worn down to its last thin thread, but had not, yet, let go. His lips had cracked. One arm was wrapped against his side at an angle that arms are not meant to keep. "I've got you," Quinn said, and she was on her knees in the doorway before she had decided to be. "I've got you, you hear me? Look at me. You're not in here anymore." She got an arm behind his shoulders and eased him toward the light, and he came without resistance, which frightened her more than fighting would have. Nico had pressed in beside her, not crowding, just there, the warm, certain weight of him against the man's leg, and something in the man's ruined breathing changed at the contact, slowed, as if some animal part of him recognized that a dog does not lie about safety. She got water to his lips, and most of it ran down his chin, and a little of it went where it needed to, and the deputy was running now, and somewhere behind her an agent was calling for the medics to move. It was while she was steadying his head that she saw the chain. A thin ball chain at his throat, and on it a single tag, military issue, the metal dulled with handling. She turned it without thinking, the way you turn anything that might tell you who a person is when the person cannot. There was a name stamped into it. It was not, she would learn, his own. It read Daniel Vale, and a service number, and a blood type, and the small clean letters seemed to mean something to the man even now, because when her thumb passed over them, his free hand came up and closed around her wrist. His grip should not have been possible. There was nothing left in him, and yet his fingers found her wrist and held, and his eyes locked onto hers at last, and stayed, burning with the whole of what remained in him, and his mouth worked twice before any sound came. "Don't," he managed. The word cost him. He pulled at her wrist as if he could pull her down into the meaning of it. "Don't take me. To them?" "To who?" Quinn leaned close. The medics were coming through the gate. She could hear the gravel under their feet. "Who? Tell me who." But his eyes had already begun their slow slide away from her face, and his hand loosened, the fingers opening one by one off her wrist, and the last thread of him that had been holding the world in focus let go. He went under without another word, his head heavy against her arm, the dog tag with another man's name swinging once, twice, and going still against his chest. Quinn knelt there in the doorway of the hot steel box with a stranger's weight against her, and the wooden beads pressing into the inside of her wrist where his grip had been, and she found that her own breathing had gone shallow and careful, matched without her meaning to the rhythm of his. Behind her, the yard had come alive with people and purpose, the whole machinery of help arriving all at once the way it always did. A little late. She looked down at the name on the tag. Daniel Vale. Not him. She was certain of it without being able to say how. A man does not wear his own name like a wound. Nico had not moved from the stranger's side. He sat in the wedge of shade the open door threw across the dust, ears still forward, watching the unconscious face with the grave attention of a creature who had decided this one belonged to him now and would not be talked out of it. "Okay," Quinn said quietly, to the dog, to the man, to the dry and indifferent valley. "Okay, we've got you." She did not yet know who they were. She did not know that the answer would take her months, or that it was already watching her from behind a face the whole county trusted. She only knew, kneeling in that doorway with the heat going out of the day, that someone had locked a living man in a box and walked away expecting the dry season to do the rest, and that her dog, for reasons she would spend a long time trying to understand, had refused to leave the door. Chapter 2. The Man Who Won't Talk. The man from the trailer slept for the better part of 2 days, and when he finally surfaced, he came up the way a swimmer comes up from too deep, all at once and fighting. Quinn was not in the room when it happened, but she heard about it from the nurse, how he had torn at the line in his arm, how he had asked where he was 3 times and refused to believe the answer, how the first full sentence he managed was a question about whether anyone had been told he was here. By the time she came back the next morning, he had decided who she was and had decided not to like it. He was sitting up against the pillows, the gray gone out of his face, and a hard wariness moved in to take its place. The beard was the same. His left arm rode in a sling, the shoulder rebuilt with pins and patience, and an old discipline showed in the way he held the rest of himself still despite it. He watched her cross the room the way a man watches a door he has not decided to trust, and when she set her credentials on the rolling tray where he could read them, he barely glanced down. "FBI," he said. The word came out flat, scraped clean of anything she could use. "Good for you." Quinn Delgado. She pulled the chair a respectful distance from the bed and sat, because looming over a person had never once made them tell her the truth. "I'm the one who found you, me and my partner." "Your partner?" His eyes moved past her to the hall, quick, checking. "Where is he?" "She," Quinn said. "And she's about 90 pounds, and she's not allowed past the nurse's station without a fight." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth and went out before it could become anything. "You want to tell me your name?" He didn't. That was the whole of his answer, a long look at the ceiling, his jaw set, the silence of a man who had learned somewhere that names were currency and his was not for spending. She let it sit. She had interviewed enough frightened people to know the difference between someone hiding what they did and someone hiding what had been done to them, and everything about him read as the second kind. The flinch when the door moved, the way his uninjured hand kept drifting to his collarbone where, she now knew, a chain and a tag had hung until the hospital cut them off and bagged them with his ruined clothes. "Whoever you're scared of," she said quietly, "they're not getting in here. There's a deputy on this floor. There's me." "You said something to me in that yard. You said don't take me to them. I've been turning it over for 2 days, and I'd like to know who they are before they decide to come looking." His hand found his bare collarbone again and closed on nothing. She changed tack. She always carried a thing or two she was not supposed to, and the dog was one of them. She'd cleared it loosely with the floor charge nurse, the way you clear things you intend to do regardless, and when she opened the door and clicked her tongue, Nico came in low and quiet and certain, nails ticking on the tile, and crossed the room as if he had been told exactly where to go. The man's whole body changed. It was not a thing he did on purpose. Quinn could see that. It was a thing that happened to him. The shepherd came to the side of the bed and did not jump and did not crowd, only lifted his scarred muzzle to rest it on the blanket near the man's good hand. Ears soft now, the working alertness folded away into something older and simpler. And the man, who had given Quinn nothing, turned his hand over and laid his palm flat against the broad warm plane of the dog's head, and breathed out, and some load he had been carrying in the muscles of his face set itself down. "Hey," he murmured, and it was not to Quinn. "Hey, you?" Nico leaned, the way shepherds lean, putting weight against the bed frame so the contact held without effort on the man's part. The patient pressure of a dog that has decided a person needs to be kept company and will not be argued with. Quinn had seen Nico do it before, in worse rooms than this one. There was nothing mystical in it. A distressed person smells and moves and breathes in a particular way, and a good dog reads all of it and answers the only way it knows, with the plain offered fact of its body. But knowing the mechanism did not make it smaller. The man's eyes had gone bright and unsteady, and he kept his face turned down toward the dog so that neither of them would have to mention it. "His name's Nico," Quinn said, careful, like setting a cup on a table she wasn't sure was level. The man scratched the base of an ear with 2 fingers, the dog's eyes half closed. For a while the room held only that, the small machinery of the monitors, the dog's slow blink, a man relearning how to touch something that asked nothing of him. "Marcus," he said at last to the dog. "It's Marcus." She did not pounce on it. "Okay, Marcus." "You found a tag on me?" His voice had changed. The flatness was still there, but it had cracks in it now, and through the cracks came something that had been kept in the dark a long time. His good hand left the dog and moved, by instinct, to the bedside drawer, and Quinn understood and got the evidence bag for him and watched him work the tag out one-handed and close it up inside his fist. He held it the way some people hold a hand they are afraid to let go of. His thumb found the stamped letters without his eyes and pressed them, hard, as if he could read them through the skin. "That's not your name," she said gently. "No." His fist tightened until the chain bit a thin red line across his knuckles. "It's my brother's, Danny." The pressure of his own grip seemed to be the only thing holding the next part in him, and then it wasn't enough, and the words came. He had a bad couple of years, the kind that take everything, and then this outfit found him, a program. They came around the places guys like him end up, and they had a name and a building and people in matching shirts, and they told him they'd get him clean and get him working and get him whole. His thumb ground at the tag, and for a while the calls sounded good. He sounded good. He sounded like Danny. He stopped. When he went on, his voice had dropped to almost nothing. And then the calls got short, and then they got strange, and then there weren't any. "How long?" Quinn asked. 4 months. The same 4 months the valley had gone without rain. "I came out here to find the place that had him. I found one of their work sites." The fist with the tag in it rose an inch off the blanket and settled again, helpless. "That's the last clear thing I've got." Nico shifted his weight and pressed his head more firmly under Marcus's hand, and Marcus let him and did not finish the sentence, and did not have to. Quinn drove back into Cordera with the windows down and the dry wind beating in and the name turning over in her head. A program, a building, people in matching shirts. And she did not go home. She went to the field office annex they'd borrowed off the county, and she pulled the loan files again, the ones that had started the whole thing, and she read them the way you reread a letter after you've learned the person who wrote it was lying. The file that stopped her belonged to a man named Hector Maldonado. On paper, Hector had walked into a bank on the east side of town 11 weeks ago and borrowed against a credit history that, the more Quinn looked at it, had no business existing. The history was clean, and it was thin, and it was new. Too new, a tree with a thick trunk and no rings. The Social Security number traced back fine, which was the problem. It traced back too fine, to a person whose every other footprint in the world had stopped years ago. Someone had taken a real thread and woven a whole cloth person around it, and that person had been given just enough life to be trusted for money and not 1 day more. She had read about it in trainings and called it by its name in reports. Sitting here at midnight with the file open, the name felt too clean for what it was. They had built a man out of a dead person's number and walked him into a bank. And Hector Maldonado, The living one, whoever he actually was, had defaulted in 9 weeks and vanished, leaving the bank holding paper and the task force holding a question. She requested the branch security footage from the day the loan was signed, and it came in grainy and overlit, the color of every bank camera since the beginning of bank cameras. And she scrubbed it to the timestamp and watched a thin, nervous young man sign his borrowed name at the loan officer's desk. He signed it slowly. He kept glancing up. Quinn slowed the playback and leaned in. There was a man standing near the rope line behind him. Not in the line. Near it. Close enough to read what was being signed, far enough to be nobody. A heavy-set figure in a plain work shirt with his hands folded in front of him and his attention fixed on the back of the young man's bent head with a patience that had nothing idle in it. He was not waiting for a teller. He never moved toward one. When Hector stood, the man drifted a half-step after him, the smallest correction, the way a handler keeps a green dog in sight. She would have let it go. A bank is a busy place. Men stand near rope lines. But the wooden beads were against her wrist, where another man's grip had been 2 days ago, and she had learned long ago to trust the cold, small feeling that came when a detail refused to lie flat. She pulled a second file, a different debtor, a different branch, a different impossible new history that had defaulted and disappeared. And she found the footage, and she scrubbed it to the signing, and she made herself breathe before she looked. Same shirt, same folded hands, same heavy-set patience, standing a careful half-step behind a different frightened person, signing a different borrowed name. The same man, in 2 places he had no reason to be, watching 2 strangers give themselves away. Quinn sat very still in the dark of the borrowed office, the 2 frozen frames side by side on the screen, and felt the case she thought she'd been handed turn quietly over in her hands and become something else, something with a shape to it and a method. And somewhere at the center of it, a building with a good name and people in matching shirts who found the kind of person no one would come looking for, and made very sure no one ever did. She thought of Marcus's fist closed around his brother's name. She thought of how he'd said it. They'd get him whole. And she reached over without looking and put her hand on Nico's head, and the dog leaned into it, and the 2 faces of the same patient stranger watched her back from the screen, and did not blink. Chapter 3. The signatures. They had Hector Maldonado in a holding room at the county building when Quinn finally got to him, and she walked in carrying the loan file and the working assumption that she was about to meet a small, clever liar. The assumption did not survive the doorway. He was younger than the footage had made him look, barely past 20, and he sat with his hands flat on the metal table the way a person sits when he has been told to keep them where they can be seen and has not stopped obeying that instruction in days. He did not look up when she came in. He looked at the door behind her, and then past it, the same checking glance Marcus had thrown at the hospital hallway, and Quinn felt the first stone of her certainty shift underfoot. "Hector," she said, and sat. "My name's Delgado. You signed for $40,000 at a bank you'd never walked into before, under a name that belongs to a man who passed away in 2009. So my first thought was that you were good at this." She laid the signature page on the table between them, face up, the borrowed name looping across the bottom. "But you're not good at this. You're terrible at this. You looked at the camera 9 times. You spelled the name wrong and corrected it. Nobody who does this for a living does that." She let that sit. "Somebody made you do this." For a long moment he stared at the page as if it might come alive. Then, very quietly, in a voice worn down to the floorboards, he told her how it worked. It started with a job. That was the part that undid her later, turning it over, that it always started with the most ordinary thing in the world, a job. A man had come to the place where Hector slept, and the others like him slept, a clean, friendly man with a clipboard and a company shirt, and he had offered work. Real work, harvest and packing and warehouse, with a van to take you there, and a bed to bring you back to, and a little taken out each week for the bed and the van and the trouble of arranging it all. You signed for the work. You handed over your papers so they could process you, your real ones, your card, the one document that proved you were a person the law would recognize. And then the papers did not come back. And the little taken out each week grew until the math stopped making sense, until you owed the company more than the company paid you, until the only thing you owned was a debt with no bottom to it. And then they explained, kindly, that there was a faster way to clear what you owed. All you had to do was come to a bank and sign your name. Not your name, a name. A name they gave you, on a card that looked new, because it was. You signed, and the money went somewhere you never saw, and the debt was forgiven a little. And if you said no, well, they still had your papers. And it was a long walk back to anywhere, and a longer one across a border, and a man with a clipboard had already explained, kindly, what could happen to a person with no papers and no friends in a dry and empty county. The company, Quinn said. Her mouth had gone dry. The shirt, what did it say? Meridian? He said it like a word in a language he'd been beaten with. Meridian Workforce. And the man who took you to the bank, who stood behind you while you signed. Hector's hands curled in on the metal table. He was always there, he said. Every time, standing close, so you knew. You always knew he was there. He swallowed. Big. Quiet. They called him the supervisor. Quinn did not run back to the annex, but it was a near thing. By that night she had every frame of bank footage the task force could pull, and she did with them the only thing the visual of it allowed. She printed the stills, the clearest face from each signing, and she put them on the wall. She stepped back, and the wall looked back at her. 14 photographs, 14 banks, 14 frightened strangers bent over 14 borrowed names. And standing behind each of them, a half step off the rope line, hands folded, eyes on the back of a bowed head, the same heavy-set man, the same plain shirt, the same patient proprietary stillness repeated down the wall like a figure stamped again and again into wet clay. She had been looking for a network, and here it was rendered in cheap inkjet, a single face you could not unsee once you had seen it, multiplied across a year of other people's worst afternoons. Quinn stood in front of the wall for a long time without moving, and the 14 versions of him stood with her, and not one of them blinked. The name came back the next morning, Reuben Pike. He drew a paycheck from Meridian Workforce as a site supervisor, which was, she supposed, exactly what he was. He supervised. He stood close so you always knew. She was still looking at his name when the annex door opened and Marcus came through it, out of the sling and into a borrowed truck and a determination she had no legal way to stop. "You're supposed to be resting that shoulder," she said. "I rested it." He crossed to the wall and stopped, and she watched the 14 faces hit him, watched him understand in 3 seconds what had taken her 2 days. His jaw worked. "Danny's not up there." "No." "Then he's still in it." He turned to her, and the wariness from the hospital was gone, burned off and replaced with something harder to manage. "Tell me what you need." "Sites, names, the program. I sat in the same rooms these guys sat in, looking for him. I know what their shirts look like. I know how they talk." "What I need," Quinn said carefully, "is a witness and a source, and you're shaping up to be a good one. What I can't have is you on a raid or at a door or anywhere a defense attorney can call you my unbadged ride-along. You're a civilian, Marcus. You're a victim. The second you stop being those things, everything you give me turns to smoke." He didn't like it. She could see that he didn't like it, the muscle in his jaw, the brother's name he was carrying behind his teeth. But he had been a disciplined man once, in some life the dog tag hinted at, and he hadn't named, and he gave her a single short nod and stepped back from the line she'd drawn, for now. The complication arrived wearing a linen blazer and a reputation. Her name was Eleanor Caro. "Nell," she said. "Please, everyone does." And she ran the Wayfair Foundation, and the county liaison brought her into the annex the way you bring in someone whose help you have already accepted. She was somewhere in her 50s, silver-haired and warm-eyed, with the unhurried grace of a person long accustomed to being the most reassuring voice in any room. Wayfair ran reentry housing and recovery beds and a victim services arm that the county leaned on precisely because nobody else would do it for free. And when she heard there were people coming out of a labor scheme with no papers and no place, she had come herself. "Whatever you recover," she said, taking Quinn's hand in both of hers, "however many people you bring out of this, we have beds, we have caseworkers, we have a path back to a name and a social security record and a life. You find them. Let us hold them." Her eyes moved to the wall of 14 faces and softened with something that looked exactly like grief. These poor people. Somebody made them disappear in plain sight. It was the right thing to say. It was, Quinn would think much later, always the right thing to say. In the moment, she felt only the plain relief of an investigator who has more victims than resources and has just been handed resources, and she thanked the woman and meant it. And Nell Caro squeezed her hand once more and let herself out into the bright, dry afternoon. And the meeting moved on. It was 3 days later, at the edge of a melon field where Meridian ran a crew, that the last thing happened. Quinn had gone to observe, nothing more, to watch a work site from a county truck and learn the shape of the operation. A woman moved among the workers with a clipboard and a Meridian shirt, checking names, and Quinn marked her as staff and then watched longer and was not so sure. The woman recruited and counted and did everything a handler does, but she did it the way the workers did everything, with one eye always on the road, and when a break came, she walked the long way around to the water cans, which took her, for 30 unwatched seconds, past the open window of Quinn's truck. She did not slow. She did not look over. She let a folded scrap of paper drop through the window onto the seat as she passed, the smallest motion, a hand opening and closing, and then she was gone among the rows again with her clipboard and her careful eyes. Quinn waited until the truck was a mile down the road before she unfolded it. The handwriting was small and pressed hard into the paper, the way you write when you have only a moment and one chance to be understood. "They have my daughter's papers." Quinn read it twice. Then she looked at the scrap a long time, at the hard-pressed letters and the word "my," and understood that the wall of 14 faces had been the easy part. That under the banks and the borrowed names and the patient man who always stood close, there was a deeper way these people were being held, a way that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with the things a person will do and keep doing when someone else is holding what they love. She folded the note back along its crease and set it on the seat beside the beads at her wrist, and drove the rest of the way into town, slow, watching the dry fields go by, thinking about all the ways there are to lock a door. Chapter 4. The Raid That Looked Like an Ending. The warrant came through on a Thursday, signed and stamped and as solid as paper ever gets, and by Friday before dawn there were 9 vehicles staged on the access road behind a stand of dead almond trees, engines off, everyone waiting on the gray. Marcus was not in any of them, and he had made his feelings about that known. "You sit this one out," Quinn had told him the night before in the annex, with the wall of 14 faces watching them both. Not because you can't handle it, because if you set one boot inside that property, every name on that warrant gets a lawyer who can say a civilian with a missing brother and a grudge was running my operation. You'd be handing them the door out. She'd softened it as much as the truth allowed. Danny needs this clean more than he needs you angry. He'd taken it the way he took most things she said now, badly, then quietly, the discipline closing back over the want like water over a stone. He'd be at the staging point, behind the line, with a radio and nothing to do. It was the most she could give him and stay inside the law, and they both knew it. When the light came up enough to move, they moved. Meridian Workforce ran out of a metal building at the back of a transport yard, a low gray structure ringed by box trucks and shipping containers, and the task force came through the gate in a single coordinated surge. Vehicles fanning, doors slamming open, agents pouring out and across the lot in the half-light with the clipped economy of people who had walked it on paper a dozen times. Quinn went in with the second element, Nico at her side, and reading the chaos for the one thing in it that mattered. Inside, the building woke all at once. Shouting, the scrape of chairs, a printer somewhere still chattering out its work, men in company shirts caught between sleep and flight. Most of them froze. One did not. Reuben Pike came through a side door at a dead run, heavy-set and fast the way heavy-set men are sometimes shockingly fast, headed for the gap between two containers and the open country beyond. Quinn saw him brake and didn't waste breath ordering him to stop. She dropped the lead and sent the dog. Nico crossed the lot in a black and tan blur, low and silent and terribly efficient. And the thing about a working shepherd at full drive is how little of it looks like rage and how much of it looks like physics. He did not lunge for the man. He cut the angle, came up alongside, and drove in at the trailing arm, and Pike's run came apart between one stride and the next, the big body wheeling, stumbling, brought up short, and folding down into the dust with the dog locked on and braced and holding, not savaging, just refusing, the whole of his 90 pounds turned into a single unarguable no. By the time Quinn reached them, Pike had stopped fighting and started cursing, and she called Nico off the bite the instant the cuffs were on, and the dog let go and stepped back and sat, panting, pleased, looking up at her for the next thing. "Good," she told him, and meant it all the way down. "Good boy." She had the evidence tech bag a scent article off Pike before they walked him to the car, a work glove from his back pocket, sealed clean into its own pouch and labeled in her own hand. The tech gave her a look, and she answered it before it became a question. "We've still got people missing," she said. "Danny Vale and however many others. If I need to put the dog on this man's track later, where he's been, where he took them, I want his scent on file and uncontaminated. Bag it." It went into the box with everything else, and there was a great deal else. The metal building gave up its secrets the way these places always did, all at once, and worse than expected. In a back room with the blinds taped down, they found the mill, a card printer, a laminator still warm, trays of blank stock for licenses and Social Security cards, a shoebox of real documents, driver's licenses, resident cards, the actual papers of actual people, held back so their owners could not become people again without permission. Filing cabinets of loan applications, a ledger of debts that bottomed out nowhere. It was, an agent said low beside her, the whole machine. It was everything. They found Victor Almeida in the front office, and he did not run, because men like Victor Almeida have never in their lives believed running was something that would ever apply to them. He was sitting behind his desk in a pressed shirt when they came in, and he watched them flip his filing cabinets with the unbothered patience of a man certain the ground beneath him is bedrock. He owned Meridian. He told them so, twice, as if it were a credential. When they read him the warrant and the charges, the labor scheme, the false documents, the fraud, he listened with something close to satisfaction, and when they were done he leaned back and almost smiled. "You want to know who built this?" he said. "Look at the sign on the building. Everything that happens here happens because I let it happen. These people," a tilt of the head toward the yard, the workers, the cuff supervisor, "they work for me. All of it. Me." He spread his hands, taking ownership of the whole ruin like a man accepting an award. "So whatever you think you've got it sitting right here." Quinn watched him claim it, the entire weight of the operation, gathered up and pinned proudly to his own chest, and felt the cold small thing turn over in her again. The same feeling the rope line had given her, the same feeling the new padlock had given her. It was too neat. He was too glad to be the top of it. But the cabinets were full, and the mill was real, and the man was confessing to ownership with both hands, and you do not argue with a gift while you are still putting it in the car. They put him in the car. By the time the sun was full up, it was over, and it had the shape of a win. 14 banks, a document mill, a debt ledger. 2 men in custody, and one of them announcing himself the architect to anyone who'd listen. The agents moved through the yard with the loose ease of people who had closed a thing, and someone clapped Quinn on the shoulder, and Nico lay in the shade of the truck with his tongue out and his eyes half shut. A dog who had done his work and knew it. The evening news made it official. Quinn watched it on the muted annex television with the captions running: Meridian's gray building, the box trucks, a county spokesman at a podium. And then the segment turned, the way these segments always turn, to the matter of the victims, and there was Nell Caro. She was standing outside a Wayfair house in the late light, silver hair catching the sun, and she spoke to the camera with her hands folded and her eyes bright with what looked, on every screen in the county, exactly like heartbreak. She was shocked, she said. She was heartbroken. To think this had been happening here, to people already so close to the edge. It was a wound to the whole community. But Wayfair stood ready. Whatever names these poor souls had been forced to wear, Wayfair would help them find their own again. There were beds. There was a path home. Let them come. It was, again, exactly the right thing to say. The county liaison, watching beside Quinn, exhaled and said something about thank God for that woman, and Quinn nodded, because in that moment she believed it too, and went back to the boxes. She worked late, alone, the way she did her best thinking, running the seized identities one by one against everything the task force could reach. Most of them resolved the way she expected: a stolen number, a Meridian work file, a forced signature, a bank. The machine, traced backward, kept arriving at the gray building, kept arriving at Alameda. It was tidy. It was almost done. And then one of them didn't. She had pulled a synthetic identity off a defaulted file, one of the cleaner builds a paper person assembled with real care. And she walked it back the way she'd walked the others, expecting Meridian at the end of the road. The number traced to a man who had passed away years before. The life built on top of it traced to a first point of contact, the place the real thread had been picked up and the false cloth begun. She found the intake record. She read it twice to be sure she was reading it right. It was not a Meridian work file. It was a Wayfair Foundation intake form. A recovery client, processed through re-entry housing, photographed and fingerprinted and folded gently into a system that promised a path back to a name. And somewhere between the kind intake and the borrowed identity, the real thread of a real person had been quietly pulled loose and woven into something else. Quinn sat back in the dark of the annex with the form in her hand and the muted television still throwing Nell Caro's heartbroken face across the wall in pale flickers. And the wind she had been holding all day went cold and strange in her hands. Alameda had claimed all of it. Alameda had been so glad to claim all of it. But the road from this particular borrowed name did not end at the gray building or the man in the pressed shirt. It ran somewhere past him to a place with good beds and caseworkers and a woman everyone in the county thanked God for. And it had been running there. She understood now, the whole time, while she stood in the bright, dry afternoon and let herself be handed resources and said thank you and meant it. Chapter 5. The Scent Doesn't Lie. By morning, Quinn had laid the whole thing out on the annex table in 3 rows, and once she saw it in 3 rows, she could not unsee it. The first row was time. Every lull in the operation, every stretch where the borrowed names stopped appearing at banks, where the work crews thinned, where the trail went quiet, lined up, week for week, with a Wayfair announcement. A new house opening, a grant, an expansion, clients relocated to a fresh facility 2 counties over with a ribbon and a photograph and Nell Caro's warm hand on a shoulder. The machine did not sleep during those lulls. It moved. The second row was money, and money pointed the same way. Reuben Pike drew a paycheck from Meridian, but the deeper Quinn pulled, the more his actual loyalties surfaced. In the small places loyalty hides. The emergency contact on a years-old form, the property his truck was registered out of, the name he'd listed when he'd needed someone to vouch. Not Almeida, never Almeida. A foundation, a founder. The third row was the intake forms, and there were more of them now. Quinn had stopped expecting Meridian at the end of the road and started looking for the real beginning of it. And again, the synthetic people had been born in the same clean, caring place. A Wayfair bed, a Wayfair caseworker, a kind hand that took your photograph and your fingerprints and your real name on the day you arrived with nothing. And somewhere after that, quietly, pulled the thread. It was, she understood, the most efficient design she had ever seen. Caro had not needed to touch a single case file of Quinn's. She had not needed to know what the task force knew. She had only needed to be the person everyone trusted with the broken, to own the door the desperate walked through, and the beds they slept in, and the services they were sent back to afterward, so that every victim the law recovered was handed, gently and with gratitude, right back into her keeping. She steered the whole county without ever reading a page of it, simply by being the one good thing it believed in. Quinn could prove the design on paper. What she could not yet prove was the woman. So she took the dog. The Wayfair Reentry Campus sat on the north edge of town, low stucco buildings the color of the dry hills behind them. And Quinn went in that afternoon on the stated and legitimate business of an agent with people still missing. Danny Vale and a dozen others who had never surfaced, who might, the Foundation had so generously offered, be sheltering under Wayfair's own roof. No one could refuse that search without asking why. Caro, when she arrived, did not refuse it. She welcomed it, both hands, bright-eyed. Of course, anything, these poor souls. Quinn worked Nico down the corridors on Pike's scent. The sealed glove from the raid, offered to him once at the truck, a name given to his nose the way you'd whisper a name to a tracker. Find him. The campus smelled of fresh paint and industrial cleaner, that particular institutional smell of a place that wants very badly to seem clean. And the dog moved through it patiently, sorting the human signatures layered into the walls the way only he could, discarding the 100 strangers, hunting the one. In a back administrative wing, past a door marked "Private" in the same gentle font as everything else, Nico stopped. He circled once, and he sat. Quinn went very still. Reuben Pike had been in a county cell for 6 days. There was no lawful reason for his scent to be anywhere on this campus, let alone fresh enough, layered thick enough, for the dog to chase it down a hallway and plant himself at a private door and refuse to be wrong about it. A dog does not read intentions. He does not know a foundation from a front or a saint from her opposite. He knows only the plain animal fact of who has been where, and Nico was telling her, with the whole still certainty of his body, that the man who stood behind 14 frightened strangers had walked these halls so often that his scent had soaked into them like water into stucco. The paint was new. The smell underneath it was not. The scent doesn't lie, her first handler used to say, back when she was the green one. People lie. Paper lies. The nose just tells you who walked by. She lifted her eyes from the dog to the woman who had followed them down the hall, and Nell Caro's face had not changed at all, and that was the thing that finished it. The warmth was still there, perfectly arranged, the heartbreak held ready. She had heard the same 6 days of news everyone had. She knew Pike was in a cell, and she stood in front of the door his scent had soaked into and offered Quinn nothing but that flawless, practiced grief. And a person who is only sad does not first make sure her face is doing sadness correctly. "You should call your people," Caro said softly, almost kindly, "before this gets away from you." Outside, an engine turned over. Then another. Quinn was already at the window. In the rear lot, 2 unmarked vans sat with their doors open and their motors running, and figures in Wayfair shirts were walking a line of people toward them. Quiet people, hollow-cheeked people, the kind of people who had learned to move when told and not ask where. An expansion, a relocation. Clients being carried with a ribbon and a photograph 2 counties out of reach before the net could close. The machine was moving, the way it always moved when the world was looking elsewhere, except this time the world was looking right at it, and Caro had simply decided to keep moving anyway. Quinn keyed her radio and called it in. Exigent, lives in transit, all units, and then everything happened at the speed such things happen. Marcus came over the back fence. She would put it together later. How he'd spent the days she'd kept him at arm's length, working the only lead no warrant could reach, leaning on the men he'd shared rooms with, looking for Danny, following the matching shirts to this campus on his own, a brother and not an agent, and bound by none of her rules. He came down into the lot at a run, and he did not go for Caro, and he did not go for the van's drivers, and some disciplined corner of him even now kept him to the one thing a civilian had any right to do. He went for his brother. Quinn shouted his name once, uselessly, through the glass. It was Nico who found Danny. The dog had broken from her side at the radio call, out a prop door into the lot, and he did not go to the vans where the line was loading. He went instead to a squat utility building at the lot's edge that everyone's eyes slid past, a thing too small and too ordinary to hold anything, and he planted himself at its roller door and would not move. Not to her call, not to the chaos. Nothing. The same unarguable sight he'd given a locked trailer in a dry yard a lifetime ago. Refusing. Insisting. Telling her in the only language he had that the empty place was not empty. They got the door up. Inside, in the close hot dark among stacked supplies, were the ones not yet loaded, the held back, the most controlled, the ones whose silence was guaranteed by papers locked in an office and children's names whispered in their ears. And among them, thinner than his brother's memory of him, and faded almost past knowing, but breathing, but his Danny. Marcus reached him a step ahead of Quinn and went down on his knees in the doorway and gathered what was left of his brother against his chest and said his name, just his name, over and over, the way you say the one word that has been locked behind your teeth for 4 months of dry season. Lupe Ferro made the last piece simple. She came out of the line she'd been herding, her own daughter's name the leash that had held her to it, and she walked straight to Quinn and put into her hands a phone and a thumb drive and a thin stack of intake forms she'd been quietly copying for longer than she'd had any reason to hope it would matter. Names, photographs, the thread, documented from the kind front door to the borrowed life. Everything the paper had only suggested, now in a hand that would testify to it. The task force came through the gate 90 seconds later, and the vans went nowhere, and the campus that had spent years being the one good thing the county believed in filled up with the plain machinery of consequence. They detained Nell Caro in the front courtyard in the late gold light beneath the tasteful sign with the foundation's name and its gentle promise of a way home. She did not run because she had never once believed running could apply to her. She turned to the gathering cameras. There were always cameras where Nell Caro was. She had built her whole empire in their warm regard. And she arranged her face one final time and began to say the right thing. The only thing, the thing that had carried her over every doubt for years. "This is a terrible misunderstanding," she said, heartbroken, reasonable, luminous with concern. "These people came to me with nothing." But the dog was sitting at the private door, and the brother was on his knees in the dust, with the lost one breathing against him, and the woman with her daughter's name, finally her own again, was handing over the proof in both hands, and for the first time in all the bright years of her good work, no one in the county was listening to Nell Caro at all. Chapter 6. Their Names. Back. The rain came back to the valley in the third week of October, the first real rain in half a year, and Quinn stood at the window of the annex and watched it darken the dust on the parking lot, and thought that nothing about the work was as fast or as clean as the weather. Caro had been charged. So had Almeida and Pike, and a handful of others whose names had surfaced once the foundation's careful walls came down. The caseworkers who had pulled the threads, the notary who had stamped the lies, the bookkeeper who had washed the money through grant accounts and good intentions. There would be trials. There would be motions and delays, and a defense built, Quinn had no doubt, around the same luminous reputation that had hidden the whole machine in plain sight for years. None of it would be over soon. That was the part no one outside the work ever understood, that the door you kicked in was the beginning, not the end, and that justice, when it came slowly, in courtrooms, in increments, long after the cameras had gone home. But the names came back. That was the part she let herself hold on to. It was slow, and it was paperwork, and it was the least dramatic thing she had ever been proud of. One by one, the people the machine had erased were helped back into existence. Real Social Security records restored, false debts challenged and unwound, the borrowed identities peeled away to reveal the actual person underneath, blinking intact. She sat with a young woman named Maricela for 3 hours one afternoon while a federal caseworker undid a $40,000 loan that had never been hers. And when it was finished and the screen said 0, the woman put her face in her hands and wept, not for the money, she said, but because for 2 years she had been afraid to say her own name out loud, and now she could. Hector got his papers back in a manila envelope, the same ones they had taken from him at the door of his first job, and he held them the way Marcus had held the dog tag, like something returned from the dead. Marcus stayed in Cordera through the worst of it, for Danny. His brother had a long road. The dry months in the Foundation's keeping had taken something out of him that did not come back as fast as weight. And there were days, Marcus told her once, when Danny would not speak, when he sat by a window and watched the door, the way they all watched doors now. Recovery had been the lie they'd used to take him. Recovery, real this time, was the slow, true thing Marcus was trying to give back, in a rented place with 2 beds and a yard where the dog was always welcome. It was at that rented place on a gray, cool evening, with the rain finally easing, that the 4 of them ended up around a table. Quinn had not planned it. She had come by with a box of Danny's restored documents and meant to leave them at the door, and somehow there was food instead. Marcus at the stove with the unhurried competence of a man who had cooked for a unit once. The small kitchen full of the smell of onions going soft and something braising long and slow, a smell that filled the whole place with the opposite of a dry, locked box. Danny set the table. Nico lay in the doorway with one eye on the stove, hopeful and shameless. They ate. That was all. There was no toast, no speech, no one naming what the evening was. There was a pot of something rich and dark that Marcus ladled out without asking how much anyone wanted, and warm bread torn by hand, and the particular taste of a meal made by someone who wanted you fed, salt and fat and long patience, the flavor of being looked after, which was a flavor most of the people in that room had nearly forgotten. Danny ate slowly, carefully, like a man relearning that food could be a kindness and not a leash. Halfway through, he laughed at something, a short, rusty sound, surprised out of him, and Marcus went very still at the stove for a second, the way you do when you hear a sound you'd been afraid was gone, and then went back to stirring as if it were nothing, so that no one would have to make it into something. Later, with Danny asleep early the way the healing sleep early, Quinn and Marcus sat on the back step and watched the last of the rain come off the eaves. "I keep doing the math," Marcus said. 4 months. I keep thinking about what I could have done with 4 months if I'd come sooner, if I'd believed the short phone calls were wrong, instead of telling myself he was just busy getting better. His hands hung between his knees. He's right there asleep, and I still can't put it down. Quinn turned the wooden beads on her wrist. She had carried them long enough to know there was no honest comfort in pretending the math didn't run. "My father wore these on the job for 30 years, she said. "When he passed, I had a case. Early, my first year. A girl. I was a day late getting to her. One day." The rain ticked off the metal eaves into the dark. "For a long time I thought if I just worked hard enough, fast enough, I'd never be a day late again, that if I carried it around it would make me sharp." She looked at the beads, smooth from 2 sets of fingers now. "It didn't make me sharp, it just made me tired. What made me sharp was him." She tipped her head at the doorway where Nico had appeared, drawn by the quiet. "And learning that you don't get to the people in time by hating yourself for the ones you didn't. You just get to the next one." Marcus didn't answer right away. "You didn't come a day late this time," he said finally. "No," she said. This time the dog wouldn't leave the door. He huffed something that was almost a laugh, and that was as close as either of them came to saying the rest of it. That whatever this was, this table, this strange small family assembled out of a locked trailer and a missing brother and a dog who refused to be wrong, it was not the beginning of anything else, and didn't need to be. It was its own thing, whole and quiet and enough. 2 people who had each spent a long time arriving late, who had, this once, arrived in time, and would carry the rest of it forward together without ever needing to name it. Nico crossed the small porch and stepped over Marcus's boots, and went, with the unerring certainty he brought to everything, to the open door. Inside, in the dim, Danny had shifted in his sleep, and one arm had fallen off the edge of the narrow bed. The dog considered him for a moment with his grave, dark eyes. Then he lay down on the floor beside the bed, in the spot where he could feel the man breathing, and rested his scarred muzzle on the sleeping stranger's hand, and let out a long breath, and closed his eyes. Quinn watched him do it, and felt something she had been carrying since a hot August morning finally set itself down. The valley was wet for the first time in half a year. The names were coming back, slow and sure, the way names do. And a man who had been locked in the dark and left for the dry season to finish was asleep in a safe bed with his brother in the next room, and a dog who had decided, for reasons no one would ever fully be able to explain, that this one belonged to him now and would not be talked out of it. Outside, the rain stopped. Somewhere past the wet fields, the clouds were breaking up, and the first stars came through, ordinary and reliable, indifferent to all of it, shining anyway. No one in that small house was invisible to anyone. No one's name belonged to anyone but themselves. And the dog slept with his head on Danny's hand, keeping the kind of watch he had appointed himself to keep, the only promise in the whole story that had never once been broken. Every story like this one begins with someone being made invisible. A man locked in a metal room and left for the dry season to finish. A young woman too frightened to say her own name out loud. People erased not with violence, but with paperwork, made to disappear in plain sight, while a whole county thanked the very person who was erasing them. But here is what the dry season could not take. Marcus spent 4 months certain he had come too late, and he learned what so many of us learn the hard way. You do not honor the people you've lost by drowning in the ones you couldn't save. You honor them by being there fully for the one in front of you now. His brother came home, not because the math finally worked out, but because he refused to stop showing up. Quinn carried an old grief on her wrist for years, certain that punishing herself would keep her sharp. It never did. What made the difference in the end was a dog who would not leave a locked door, and that is the heart of it. In a story full of people who lied, who wore borrowed names and practiced their sorrow in the mirror, the only promise never once broken belonged to a creature who could not speak at all. Nico didn't know a saint from her opposite. He only knew who needed him, and he stayed. The ones who love us most are so often the ones asking for the least. So today, look a little closer at the people the world walks past. Learn someone's real name. Stay with the one in front of you. And if there's a loyal soul waiting at home who asks for nothing but your company, go rest your hand on their head and tell them they're a good one. No one's name belongs to anyone but themselves. And it is never too late to find your way back to your own. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Like this video and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and the quiet ones who refuse to give up. You are seen, you are never invisible, and no door stays locked for good.